On the morning of June 3, 1937, Wallis Simpson married the man who had given up the British throne for her. The ceremony was held at the Château de Candé in the Loire Valley, a borrowed house in a foreign country with no member of the British royal family present. That evening, she wrote to Ernest Simpson, her second husband, the man whose footsteps she still heard coming down the hallway at night in her dreams, the man she addressed using their shared private nickname for the new Duke of Windsor. In these letters, Peter Pan. She wrote, "I think of us so much, though I try not to." Her new husband was Edward, Duke of Windsor, formerly His Majesty King Edward VIII. He had abdicated 6 months earlier. He had walked away from the most powerful throne on earth and from a global empire administered in his name. The BBC broadcast his farewell. Schoolchildren in 30 countries heard it on the radio. He said he couldn't discharge his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. And the woman he loved wrote to her ex-husband from her honeymoon to say she was thinking about him instead. That sentence, confirmed by biographer Anne Seba, who in 2011 discovered 15 previously unpublished letters from Wallis to Ernest in a private archive, is where the myth of the love story of the century begins to collapse. Not with a scandal, with a letter, with a woman writing in private what she could never say in public, that she had ended up in the wrong life, through no mechanism she had wanted or chosen. Wallis Warfield was born in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, on June 19, 1896. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was an infant. She grew up in relative poverty in Baltimore, dependent on wealthier relatives, and developed early a ferocious social intelligence, a talent for reading rooms, for calibrating her manner to the company, for making men in positions of power feel they were the most interesting person she had ever encountered. She wasn't considered conventionally beautiful. Even sympathetic observers called her jolly, plain, intelligent. What she had instead was precision. Every word landed. Every gesture was considered. She turned social access into an art form. By the time she married Ernest Simpson in 1928 and moved to London, she had found something that suited her. A stable, comfortable existence built on connection and careful curation. Ernest was an Anglo-American shipping executive, reliable, cultured, not particularly passionate. They weren't, Seba writes, passionately in love. But they built a life that worked. A London residence, a well-placed social circle, a position in the kind of society Wallis had spent her childhood pressing her nose against from the outside. She was introduced to Edward, then Prince of Wales, on January 10, 1931, at a house party arranged by Lady Furness. It took 3 years for the relationship to become romantic. By the end of 1934, it was, in his official biographer Philip Ziegler's word, consuming. What Ziegler actually wrote was this: by early 1934, the Prince of Wales had become slavishly dependent on Wallis, and he would remain so until he died. Slavishly dependent. From the man authorized to write Edward's official biography, with full access to the private papers. That phrase tells you everything about what this relationship actually was before you get anywhere near the abdication. Chips Channon, the Conservative Member of Parliament whose social diaries are one of the most precise eyewitness records of 1930s British upper-class life, watched the dynamic from inside the rooms where it played out. He described Wallis in his diary as a jolly, plain, intelligent, quiet, unpretentious, and unprepossessing little woman, who nonetheless commanded something unmistakable. She has already the air of a personage who walks into a room as though she almost expects to be curtsied to. She has complete power over the Prince of Wales. Channon's own home at 5 Belgrave Square, became what he called a court for the king-in-waiting and his twice-married American mistress. What Wallis wanted from that court, by every account, wasn't the throne. Being the Prince of Wales's companion in the mid-1930s was its own category of privilege, one that required no formal position and carried no constitutional weight. Fort Belvedere, the prince's weekend retreat in Windsor Great Park, was open to her. Extraordinary jewelry arrived as gifts, pieces Edward commissioned specifically for Wallis throughout 1935 and 1936, extraordinary in their scale and value. The social circuit ran between country houses, yachts, and the best restaurants in London and Paris. Seba's summary of what Wallis was seeking is plainly stated: an adventure, a swan song before she was 40, just to reassure herself she was still attractive to men, and to give Mr. and Mrs. Simpson a leg up in society. Power adjacent to a prince isn't the same as wanting to replace a queen. Wallis understood that distinction precisely. What she had was comfortable, enviable, and not permanent in a way that required anything to be sacrificed. That calculation ended on January 20th, 1936, when George V died at Sandringham and Edward ascended the throne as Edward VIII. The geometry of the situation shifted immediately. Historian John Charmley has described the new king plainly as someone who suffered from an unstable, neurotic character and needed a strong, stabilizing partner, a role that Mrs. Simpson was unable to provide. His courtiers, who had watched the relationship develop across 1934 and 1935, were, in Ziegler's account, increasingly alarmed as her role became more prominent and impinged on the performance of his duties. Edward left state papers unattended, missed official engagements, and treated the mechanisms of constitutional monarchy as interruptions to his private life. The day after his accession, he broke royal protocol by watching the proclamation of his own succession from a window of St. James's Palace, standing next to the still married Wallis Simpson. By November 1936, with the constitutional crisis building and British newspapers finally breaking a story they had suppressed for months, Channon was writing in his diary that the king was insane about Wallis. Insane. And noting with alarm that Edward was simultaneously pro-German, against Russia, and against too much slipshod democracy. Channon added, on November 22nd, that he shouldn't be surprised if he aimed at making himself a mild dictator. That diary entry was written 18 days before the abdication. None of this was Wallis's design. The letters make that explicit. In October 1936, she had moved temporarily to Felixstowe for her divorce proceedings, to be heard at Ipswich Assizes. The decree nisi from Ernest Simpson was granted on October 27th. 2 days before the hearing, on October 25th, she wrote to Ernest, "I really can't concentrate on anything at the moment, my dear. I have had so much trouble and complications with everyone. Also, I am terrified of the court, etc. I feel small and licked by it all. I am sorry for myself. I am sorry for the king. I hate stuffy British minds. And last but not least, I don't understand myself, which is the cause of all the misery. Give me courage." She was asking her estranged husband for courage before the hearing that would dissolve their marriage. She wasn't writing to the king. By late November, the crisis had made her position untenable in public. She made a decision. She would leave. On November 30th, she wrote to Ernest explaining that she had told Edward the old search for hats story, a fabricated errand, to slip away from him. The reason she needed a fabricated story, biographer Anna Pasternak documents, was that Edward had threatened suicide if she left him. Pasternak's account is direct. He threatened suicide if she left him. He threatened that no matter where she went in the world, he would follow her. He was almost deranged when it came to his obsession or need with her. Seba's analysis arrives at the same conclusion from a different angle. She writes, There's no question she wanted out. She couldn't get out. The king was so needy. He'd threatened suicide. She couldn't possibly take on responsibility for his death. Seba makes the psychological architecture explicit. She may have looked on Ernest as a father figure, but she landed with Edward, who needed her as a mother. Wallis fled to the south of France. She made it to Caen, to the Villa Louviers. On December 7th, Lord Brownlow, Edward's own lord-in-waiting, appeared and pressured her to issue a public statement. She agreed. Brownlow read to the press a statement he had helped her draft, indicating her readiness to withdraw from the situation entirely. Her solicitor, John Theodore Goddard, described the reality plainly. His client was ready to do anything to ease the situation, but the other end of the wicket was determined. Edward signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, in the presence of his 3 surviving brothers, the Dukes of York, Gloucester, and Kent. The following evening, December 11th, Sir John Reith of the BBC introduced the former king, now His Royal Highness Prince Edward, for his broadcast from Windsor Castle. The speech had been shaped by Walter Monckton, Edward's legal advisor throughout the crisis, who also drew up the instrument of abdication itself. Churchill had worked on its tone. The passage that would define how history remembered the abdication described Edward's inability to discharge his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. Those words sealed what Monckton later called history's commemoration of the romantic view of the event. Reith spoke with Monckton minutes after the broadcast ended. He asked about Mrs. Simpson. Monckton replied that he couldn't find words for her. Wallis heard the broadcast from Cannes. 8 days later, on December 19, 1936, she wrote to Ernest, "None of this mess and waking emptiness is of my own making. It's the new Peter Pan plan. I miss you and worry about you. Oh dear, wasn't life lovely, sweet, and simple? I wake up in the night sometime and think I must be lying on that strange chaise longue and hear your footsteps coming down the passage of the flat, and there you are with the Evening Standard under your arm. I can't believe that such a thing could have happened to 2 people who got along so well." Ernest Simpson, reading letters like this from his side of the wreckage, wrote to his mother on January 20th, 1937, "I can't see much happiness ahead for those 2 poor people who have made this mess. What will their life be?" He also wrote, with the dark humor of a man whose ex-wife had accidentally dismantled the British monarchy, that his mother should be more careful in picking daughters-in-law who go about wrecking the British Empire. After all, we haven't got kings to hand out left and right. There is a separate layer to all of this, one the establishment was careful to keep outside the love story's frame. Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister who managed the constitutional crisis, wasn't primarily concerned with the theological problem of a king marrying a 2-time divorcee. His concern, and the concern of the palace, the cabinet, and significant elements of the civil service, was Edward himself. Baldwin's biographer has written that perhaps his greatest service to the nation was engineering Edward VIII's eviction from the throne and replacing him with George VI. Given Edward's attitude to the Nazis, you might call this a preparation for war. The new king's sympathies weren't secret to those observing him closely. Channon's November 1936 diary noted his pro-German position explicitly. Andrew Lowney's research in The Traitor King documents that Edward privately believed every drop of blood in my veins is German, considered the Second World War a conflict that should never have been fought, and held the view that Hitler was not such a bad chap. In October 1937, 11 months after leaving the throne, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor toured Germany. They dined with Goebbels, Göring, Ribbentrop, and Speer. They had tea with Hitler. Edward had promised the British government he would keep the visit quiet. By July 1940, the SS had a code name for an operation targeting him: Operation Willy. The plan was to kidnap the Duke of Windsor, then living in Lisbon, and use him as leverage for either a peace settlement with Britain or restoration to the throne after an anticipated German conquest. The operation failed. Its existence, documented in captured German intelligence files, indicates precisely what the Nazis calculated about the former king's sympathies and his potential utility. Baldwin had removed Edward from the throne 6 months before the image of him in Germany was published. The constitutional mechanism he used was Wallis. The strategic calculation was something else. Edward and Wallis married at the Château de Candé on June 3, 1937. George VI granted her the title of Duchess of Windsor, but issued letters patent explicitly denying her the style of Her Royal Highness. Edward was furious. He remained furious about it for the rest of his life, and that fury became, in a way, the organizing energy of the exile years. Hugo Vickers' research in Behind Closed Doors documents how thoroughly the pursuit of recognition, of titles, of acknowledgement from an institution that had resolved the matter permanently consumed the Duke. They moved between Paris, New York, and Palm Beach, living as society celebrities on the international circuit. Edward had no meaningful function. He had abdicated not just the throne, but any claim on purposeful engagement with the world. Seba states it without qualification. Nothing else in his life gave him any sense of achievement other than his marriage to Wallis. Which meant Wallis had to be everything. The purpose, the structure, the justification for the sacrifice. She had to be the legend. Her own words for what that required. You have no idea how hard it's to live out a great romance. The letters to Ernest continued even after the wedding. She wrote to him apologizing for not sending a Christmas gift, explaining she couldn't emerge from her prison. She criticized Mary Kirk, Ernest's new wife, Wallis's friend since boarding school, for what she called publicity-seeking. She continued using Peter Pan between them as a reference to some childish lapse of Edward's behavior that had affected Ernest directly. The nickname was still in active use years after the abdication. The correspondence itself tells you the distance between the myth and the reality. Wallis, inside the romance of the century, was writing to the man she missed about the childish behavior of the man she was stuck with. From 1940 to 1945, Edward served as governor of the Bahamas, a posting that functioned less as a role than as a mechanism for keeping the couple out of Europe and away from the conversations their presence complicated. After he relinquished the office in 1945, the social circuit resumed. Decades of dinners, decades of the same faces, the same expatriate world, the same hotel suites. Edward's possessiveness never loosened. His dependence on Wallis as the axis of his entire existence never diminished. She managed a man who had no purpose beyond his obsession with her, in a life that had been built around a love story that both of them, in their different ways, had never entirely inhabited. Edward died in Paris on May 28, 1972. Queen Elizabeth II had visited the couple at their home in the Bois de Boulogne on May 18th, 10 days before, Edward too ill to leave his bedroom. After his death, Wallis had what the exile years had never given her: silence. It wasn't peace. She lived in increasing isolation, supported by an allowance from the Queen and Edward's estate. She suffered falls. She broke her hip twice. By 1980, she had lost the ability to speak. In her final years, she was bedridden, seeing only her doctor and nurses. Her French lawyer, Suzanne Blum, held power of attorney. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89, from bronchial pneumonia, in the Paris house where Edward had died 14 years before her. Her funeral was held on April 29th at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip attended both the ceremony and the burial. Princess Diana was present. Diana said afterwards that it was the only time she had ever seen the Queen weep. The love story, as Edward told it on December 11, 1936, was clean. A king, a woman, a sacrifice made freely. It served the establishment, which needed the abdication to look like a personal choice rather than a political removal. It served Edward, who needed the abdication to mean something beyond his own catastrophic unsuitability for the role. It served the legend, which had commercial and cultural value for decades, and which still circulates in dramatized form as evidence that romantic love can override every institutional force. Seba, who spent years with the 15 letters in that private archive, does not reach a romantic conclusion. She describes what the archive actually shows: a tale of Gothic darkness with a Faustian pact at its core. As with all such pacts, the devil eventually claimed his reward. What Wallis Simpson actually wanted, from October 1936 through to the honeymoon letters and the decades of correspondence that followed, was the life she had before January 20th, 1936. Not the throne, not the exile, not the legend. Ernest's footsteps in the hallway, the Evening Standard under his arm. A flat in London where things had been lovely, sweet, and simple. She wrote those words on December 19, 1936, 8 days after the most famous abdication in modern history, to the man the king had replaced. And she kept writing to him, from the honeymoon, from the prison, from inside the myth, for years. Two people, one wrong life, bound together by a story that served everyone's interests except theirs. Edward gave the broadcast that made the legend permanent. Wallis gave the letters, in the other direction, to the wrong man for the rest of her life. Subscribe for more stories like this.